In this video, we're going to learn about a time period known as the Gilded Age, which Mark Twain actually coined in his book to illustrate what this time period was really like. If you look up the term gilded in the dictionary, it will tell you a thin layer of gold. And that's essentially what Mark Twain was saying. On the outside, it looked very beautiful in the United States, but internally, when you scratch the surface, you could see the ugliness underneath. So let's go ahead and dive in. The Gilded Age is the time period that really coincides with something known as the Second Industrial Revolution, and there really is no official end of it. I would say, early 1900s if I had to give it a specific time, but it does start immediately after the Civil War, when the United States start to focus more on business and growing as a country economically. It grows at an astounding pace and magnitude. And it's also the time period in which industrial growth is magnifying. One of the big things that we also see is the fact that that government backs off and allows big business to flourish and grow, but unfortunately at the cost of an expense of the worker, which we'll talk about as well. We also see some big cities grow during this time period. New York, before the Gilded Age, was actually the third biggest city in the United States, and of course it's one of the biggest cities in the world today. But you can see these cities that were industrial cities grow at an astounding magnitude during this time period. So this is a visual. I'm going to move myself out of the way here a little bit so you can see it. But essentially, this is a visual that really shows you about the time period and just kind of tells you all the things that were included during the Gilded Age. So if you want to pause it here, you're welcome to do. This is a really good graph too. It kind of shows you, and this is in your book, in the Phoner book as well, but it basically tells you how the United States really grew from this time period. And you can also pause this if you really want to take a look. But in this, you can see that in almost every field, the economy is growing. And actually, the economy is going to become more urbanized as more and more people move into the urban areas. Immigrants tend to grow and come into this area as well. But you can pause it and take a look at that if you want to. Like I kind of mentioned before, part of the reason for this is just the sheer amount of innovations that were developed during this time period. This is kind of a short list of different innovations, which I'll show you more on the next slide. But essentially, the fact that there was very little government regulation and a vast amount of inventions during this time period really grows and flourishes. And so again, you can take a look at that if you'd like to. One of the reasons that they're able to grow so much during this time period, though, is because of the monopolies that flourish during this time period. And this is where the term monopoly really comes from. So a monopoly is basically when one company or one person essentially owns all of the business, right? If you think of the game Monopoly, that's where it comes from, right? Or the game Monopoly, that's where it comes from. So essentially, businesses do something in order to control all of the profits. They can do this through something called vertical integration or horizontal integration. So a lot of the big businesses form trusts in order to avoid the look or the view that they were owning all of this. But a trust or monopoly was essentially the same thing. They controlled everything. So competition really goes away during this time period, and what happens when you have competition, right? It keeps the prices down. So the absence of competition means that prices are going to go up. The person that owns the company can essentially set the prices whatever way they want. And so I mentioned this just briefly, but I'm going to go into an explanation on the difference between the two different ways that people are able to gain a monopoly, either through vertical integration, where they essentially they basically will own all the means of production. So if we're talking about McDonald's, for example, they own the cows, they own the paper mill that makes the paper that wraps the burgers. So every aspect of production they own, so they're able to set the prices any way that they want to, right? Because nobody can beat their prices because they own those means of production. The more common one, the one that we think about, and this is more like a monopoly game, is the one called horizontal integration. And that is essentially when a firm owns and buys up all of the businesses or blows them up in some cases. And so this was probably the more common way of obtaining monopolies. Andrew Carnegie was much more famous with vertical integration, and Rockefeller was very famous about horizontal integration. So these are the two ways that really they do this. So here's some examples of some of the bigger giants that we'll talk about and are the source of some of your primary sources this week as well. So really historians look at these people, Andrew Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Rockefeller, just to name a few. Some of them view them as people that pushed America's economy forward. They were captains of industry. They led the United States forward. But many historians look at them as ruthless people that did anything and did it all in the back of workers in order to propel their business, right? They were actually, and there really is a true story that this time period, one of the reasons why we don't know much about the presidents during this time period is because they had less power than these big businessmen. They would have to, if the president wanted to visit one of these big businessmen, they would actually have to, set an appointment. They were more important than the president during this time period. So this kind of leads me right into talking about some of the social issues during this time period, which is eventually going to lead us right into the progressive era, which will be our next really big unit. But essentially, half of the wealth in the United States was owned by the top 1% of the country, these big businessmen. That means that the other 50% of the millions and millions of people was split amongst the rest of the United States. So it was extremely inequitable. Okay, and so many states start to investigate this. Wisconsin, Richard Follett was probably one, or Robert Follett, not Richard Follett. He was actually a governor that does investigate this, and there are people that do this, but essentially they don't really get anywhere because a lot of the politicians are actually in the pockets of these big businessmen. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting picture. This is Fifth Avenue, which is only like 2 miles north of the tenements and the poverty. So they were very, close to each other as well. This is also a time period in which businessmen justified their wealth through something known as social Darwinism. Just to give you a little background on this, Darwin and Origin of Species, I think, comes out around the 1850s, 1860s. And so they apply this idea of survival of the fittest to, to society. So that's what a lot of these big businessmen do in order to justify the fact that they had such a large accumulation of wealth and they were not giving their workers that kind of money. The poor, were responsible for their own poverty. And again, I'm going to say this several times. A lot of this is because of this idea, this attitude the United States government had at the time called laissez-faire government, which is hands off. That's what it means in French, and essentially allows the big businessmen to grow and have this kind of social Darwinistic type of viewpoint. And the courts and the government support big business at this time consistently. When there's strikes, the government actually sends in troops to stop the strikers. So a lot of support of this, okay? But because of this doesn't mean that the workers were silent. This is a time period when we start to see the very first formation of unions in the United States. So many workers had little control over their work and wages, and you had semi-skilled machine operators were easily to be replaced, right? Because they weren't like very skilled, so it was easy to replace them with scabs. They didn't know anything. There was no unemployment insurance or anything. The people did try to strike, but it wasn't successful, and most of the workers were extremely poor. So I want to put this in perspective for you a little bit. They were working 6 to 7 days a week, 70 hours a week, okay? Tons of hours and very labor intensive work. This is not like today. We don't have the 40-hour work week until like the 1940s or 50s, where that was actually regulated. Okay, so labor organizes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but they weren't really they weren't really successful during this time period. They formed, but they don't get very far. One of the first labor unions we'll talk about that organized was the Knights of Labor, and they were really unique in the sense that they were extremely inclusive. During the late 1800s, can you imagine a labor organization that included not just skilled and unskilled workers, which was also rare, but they also allowed women, blacks, people from all different types of life, right? All different types of immigrants to join these unions. Unfortunately, when they do try to start striking, and the Knights of Labor is much more militant than a lot of the other labor organizations that come up during this time period. But one of the very first instances of them trying to organize and strike and protest the kind of wages was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And so they were protesting the long labor hours, the very unsafe working conditions, mostly because of it. And essentially what was happening was, because of this strike, rail traffic was not moving. And so the government steps in to try to say, hey, well, you know what? They're paralyzing the United States economically. So instead of coming in and trying to like negotiate between the two groups, they sent a militia unit in to force them back. And in this particular strike, in this peaceful strike, there were 20 strikers that were killed during this event. And so there is actually a video down, or actually it should be, well, no, it should be down below on this module that you can watch that talks about the formation of unions and the railroad strike at that as well. Like I mentioned before, there's a large gap between the rich and the poor. And I already mentioned this statistic essentially, but the richest 1% had the same income as the bottom 50% of the United States, right? Or the rest of the United States itself. And so that is an enormous gap of wealth between the rich and the poor. People begin to write and talk about this. This is the beginning of the Progressive Era, which again is part of, I think chapter 18 really in our book, but we do see people starting to speak out about this. Some people wrote books, so this is the very first time we start to see dystopian and utopian novels that really address this inequality that happened. But one of the most fascinating was a photojournalist by the name of Jacob Riis. And you can see he wrote a book called, or he didn't write a book. This was actually part of a photojournalist book. A photojournal just had pictures in it called How the Other Half Lives. And so he simply took photographs of what it was like, the kind of poverty. This is a tenement here. These are young mine workers over here. These are children, you can see. And you can tell from the snow that it's very cold here. They're sleeping over a furnace to keep warm. So you can pause it and take a real look at those pictures. I encourage you to do that. They're fabulous pictures that really, primary sources that take a look during this time period. And so I mentioned this before, but there were a lot of different people that began to talk about, what was happening. And these are mainly middle-class educated reformers. And a lot of the reformers were actually women, interestingly enough. And so utopian, dystopian novels begin to come out. Here's just some of them that came out during this time. And they really kind of talk about this social issue through literature. So we see start of that. There are also people like Walter, and I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce his last name, but he was a German Presbyterian minister that starts this social gospel movement. And so this idea of laissez-faire he thought was super, unfair. But he also believed that the church and the Christian had a duty to help those that were impoverished. And so this was kind of like a mix of what his own German heritage and the socialism that they had in Germany at the time mixed in with his own Christian beliefs. And he believed that it was important to be the hands and feet of God while they were here on earth. And that meant to open soup kitchens, to help the impoverished and things like that. And we start to see people like Rauschenbusch, I'm sure I mispronounced his name, start to speak out against, the poverty and what he was seeing during this time. So one of the other big labor events, I talked about the Great Railroad Strike in a couple slides previously, but one of the biggest one was the Haymarket Affair. And so a lot of these social conflicts really culminated in some of these big labor uprisings, and the Haymarket Affair is one of these very, very big ones that happen. It really starts, it's in Chicago. Iron molders begin to strike about the conditions that they were in the workforce. This is led by the Knights of Labor. In this peaceful speech, there were 4 strikers that were killed. So the next day, they hold a meeting in order to talk about what had happened about the 4 strikers being killed. And so they had held a big meeting because of this, right? And so it was a meeting after these 4 strikers were killed. A bomb explodes. Nobody to this day knows exactly what happened, who set the bomb off, right? But people do believe that it was a group of anarchists. There were anarchists that were part of these labor unions. I'm not saying they made up a majority of them, but that some of them were in some of these labor organizations. But either way, police used the bombings as a way to arrest anybody who they viewed as radical. And also, so basically 8 anarchists were convicted, 4 were hanged. One of them committed suicide before anything really happened, but it turns out that there really wasn't any evidence. And a couple of the people actually weren't even at the rally who were convicted of this. Part of the people that were convicted. So there's a great video if you're a fan of drunk history. There is a video clip just below on drunk history video that is excellent. That talks about the Haymarket Square protest and riot. So I encourage you to pause and watch that one. That one is a really good one. I briefly mentioned this at the beginning of the video too, but Mark Twain's book, The Gilded Age, comes out, and it has people really second guessing what was happening. Not just, business-wise, but also what was happening politically, because the politics of it, there was a lot of corruption scandal during like Grant's administration, but it continued after that, and it was also at the city level, at the state level, and so basically these big businessmen were getting as far as they could because people were in the pockets of the big businessmen. They had great influence over the legislature. And like I mentioned before, urban politics, which is the big city, were often corrupted by something known as political machines. And so this is a political cartoon here of a political boss that essentially controlled the city politics, took kickbacks and things like that. And nobody could run for mayor, or do anything, or buy anything, or be a part of anything in New York City, for example, unless they went through the party boss, these political machines. Even San Antonio had its own political machine, a guy named Brian Callahan, who they called King Callahan at that time. And lawmakers during this time period also support these big businessmen. A lot of them invested in a lot of these businesses for that reason. There were a couple big scandals that broke out. One was the Crédit Mobilier scandal, which essentially happened. A corporation was formed by Union Pacific Railroad stockholders. They made contracts with themselves. They sold stock and gave stock to politicians to keep them quiet and have them rule in favor of them. When that broke out, that was one of the biggest scandals that happened. Also, the whiskey ring with the Grant administration that defrauded the federal government out of like millions of dollars. So again, there were a couple of really big political scandals. But one of the most interesting was an urban political boss at the local level by the name of Boss Tweed. And essentially, I think people estimate he stole about $34 million. And essentially, he would just get the favor of the immigrants that came in. So immigrants would come into the, into the cities. He would promise to do things for them and essentially got their vote through that way, right? But they ended up, very stealing money, taking bribes and favors and things of that nature. So some people estimate $34 million that he stole from the city. And we're talking about the late 1800s, right? But there's a really great video from the Bill of Rights Institute about Boss Tweed. It's great. And one of the things I love about it is a guy at New Yorker is like narrating half of it, and he's hilarious in this. But he also represents a lot of the feelings about Boss Tweed. So I encourage you to pause that and watch that. We're going to talk more about the reform that actually happens because of the Gilded Age, but I do want to mention, and we'll do that when we get to chapter 18, but I do want to mention that there were several attempts at government reform during this time period. So in 1887, the seal that's right behind me here was the Interstate Commerce Act, the ICC, which is still in place today, that attempted to set the price of railroads at a certain percentage. It attempted to regulate the railroads at that, and the Pendleton Civil Service Act attempted to stop, people buying their way into office, and they, set some limits and made them pass an exam in order to serve in the government. And then probably one of the biggest ones was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which basically said you couldn't have a monopoly. And the Sherman Antitrust Act is actually going to be really effective, but not until the 1900s, 1901, when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. So it's that, and as a law for 11 years until somebody actually enforced it, and that of course was Teddy Roosevelt. So that is really it. That is all we're going to talk about. But and we'll pick it up with the progressive movement, which really reformers come out of that because of these social inequalities of the Gilded Age. But hopefully that was interesting to you and you learned a little something about this very lesser known time period.